I want to take a look at this incredible example. It starts on page 32 of the Kashinawa Indian tribe in the Amazon. 32, 33. Do you remember reading this? It's a brilliant example. Well, do I have to read it, or let me just sort of summarize it? The Indians are called. They're in the middle of a conversation, or addressees. And when they say, when they get around the fire at night or wherever, okay, when they're talking to each other, they will talk about something having been said to them, okay, addressed to them, and it's a story, okay, and then they will tell the story, okay, and when they tell the story, they will change it, okay, and the value of the story is their ability to be ingenious in telling the story. Okay. It's sort of like Scheherazade. Yeah. If Scheherazade does not tell a good story, she's going to lose her head. Okay. In other words, what story is good sex. Is what it comes down to. Have you read Lost in the Funhouse? The paradigm that is used is to be a writer, you have got to be Scheherazade. You can't stop writing, and you have to find a really ingenious story over and over and over again. But it's that way with whatever it is that you do: paint, make music, cook.
There's a Louis Bourgeois quote about Scheherazade, how she has to continue speaking the word of castration. For her, she feels that silence is a more powerful place to be, because she's coming from visual art. I think that's kind of interesting.
She is able to outwit, the man that she's serving, and avoid the cut, okay, the logic of the cut. She's able to tell really interesting stories. About death. To hold off, momentary, is the expression, momentary. Help me. Execution is like a momentary stay of execution. Stay, it's another status word. So it starts out like this: I am going to tell you the story of X. Here he inserts the name of the hero, as I have always heard it. And then he adds, listen to it. In other words, he presents himself without giving his own name. He only relays the story. He presents himself as having first been the addressee of a story of which he is now the teller. Every narrator presents himself, second full paragraph, page 32, as having first been a narratee, not an autonomous, okay, like the rest of us in modernity, which has never been with us. Then, but on the contrary, as heteronomous, the law of his narrative, if I can speak of law in such a case, is a law that it has received. It is only at the end of the story, which he always ends by saying, here ends the story of X. It is told to you by Y, that his name is given, or rather his double name, his Cash and Hua name, and his name in Spanish or in Portuguese, depending on whether he is registered in Peru or in Brazil, since the Caxinia territory territory straddles the border. Very important. It's got to be people on the border. And when you get to the different towards the end of the book, which is an extension of this book, very methodical extension of this book, about language games and the job of a philosopher is to discover difference and to bear witness to new idioms that will bring about justice. You know what a differend is. One person is using a presumption over the other. Okay, it's like a scientist talking to a theologian. Okay. And if the scientist gets his or her way, then there's going to be a differend. In other words, they're begging a question because they haven't agreed on what the stasis point is. Okay, that which they would hope to come. And there appears to be no third person to adjudicate between the two. So then it becomes a game of creating new idioms. What's an idiom? That which does not exist in a language. It's idiomatic, it's, you know, it's idiotic or something like that. Like, it's raining. What's raining? I mean, a lot of people make jokes out of that. Okay? It's raining. What's the sit? What's the antecedent? Okay. It is only at the moment that his name as a narrator, his proper name, is given. Okay? After and not before. And what is striking is that when one of the listeners takes up the story some other time, he forgets. There's a forgetting here again, as you would find in a prescription. A forgetfulness, a forgiving. Tie that up with Derrida. Okay. The name, he forgets the name of the previous narrator. It's told by anonymous. No one knows. Since he does not, this is worse than gossip or hearsay. If you were in the court, you would try to tell. In fact, you're going to see in the next film Where the Green Ants Dream, in the Herzog film. You have the Aborigines, okay, in Australia, and they don't have written laws like, you know, the British who are there, the Commonwealth, okay, have their written laws and histories of laws to work from. But the Aborigines have song lines. They have this very sacred carved. I don't know what it is. Okay, it's like a map for them. Okay, of the song lines and so on. And they can only show it to the judge. They can't show it to anybody else because that would be profane. This is sacred. Okay? And the law is written there. Okay, but the Commonwealth, you know, a judge is not going to accept this. So what happens is, and it's just incredible. No, I don't think anyone could have shot a better scene than Herzog shot for this, to get this across, that the violence that takes place. And then they bring one really holy man in, who's an Aborigine, and he's the only one who speaks his own language. No one else knows his language. He's totally alone. Can you imagine? It's one thing to go to another country and say you can't find anyone who knows English or French or German or whatever, okay? And you're the only one who has this language. Totally. But at the same time, he's in this world, the Aborigines world, so he's not alone. And it's interesting how he interrupts the courtroom procedure. Very, very quietly. He stands up very slowly and walks over, you know, to the stand, and then he speaks to the judge. And this is as if no one has ears. So he forgets the name of the previous narrator since he doesn't know. One has always heard it told. That's what he says. Just jump. Okay. This is paganism. And then look what he says on page 33. The relevant feature is not faithfulness. It's not because one has perceived the story well that one is a good narrator, faithful to the story, the original, okay? The scientific view of it. It's like when you deal with people who are philologists. It's as if they live on Mars or someplace like that, and they say, I really understand what the Greeks were saying. You know. That's time travel. You know, science fiction is what it is. Okay. I have friends, and, well, we're good friends because, you know, I laugh at them and they think I'm a scandal. So and that's good. That's reciprocity. The relevant feature is not faithfulness. It is not because one has preserved the story well that one is a good narrator, at least as far as profane narratives are concerned. On the contrary, it is because one hams it up. Hams it up. Because one invents, because one inserts novel episodes that stand out as motifs against the narrative plot line, which, for its part, remains stable. That one is successful. When we say tradition, we think identity without difference, whereas there actually is very much difference. The narratives get repeated but are never identical. So this is against the first principle of logic, right? Identity. Homeland Security. Okay, and then on page 34, there's this rich section about variance. Okay, what I've been working on for the last 10 years is the question. We have variance of Helen, okay, and all of the other women who were raped or abducted or whatever, okay. But we keep Helen of Troy, okay. So we keep telling those stories instead of the other stories. Now we have, it's not that we don't have variance, and there are writers who write about Helen for young adults. 15, 16, 17, 18, maybe that's not an adult. But anyway, for them, stories. And they do come up with novel versions where Helen is not, she doesn't go to Troy. I mean, there were two versions already where Helen didn't go to Troy at all. Okay? And so, but we keep going back as educators, and we're teaching, and you know, whether it's a film that, you know, once again, of Troy, or it's, reading, you know, whatever the classic texts are, and we hold on to it. Why is it that we hold on to those? Okay. And what can we do to extricate ourselves, knowingly, unknowingly, from telling those same damn stories again? And what are those stories all about? A rape narrative that is the founding, the ground of a civilization. And who cares for grounds after that? I mean, who wants to talk about grounding? I don't. I would take my chances with the abyss, the Emperor.
You saw the recent Troy movie? The one that came with Wolfgang Peterson?
Is it
like Brad Pitt.
Okay.
Like,
maybe
I think they want to.
But it's the same, basically the same story.
Basically, but it seems that for excitement's sake, they want to kind of conflate a little bit of the Iliad and the Odyssey. But then they take they make changes. Like, for example, Agamemnon dies there. And I thought maybe you saw it.
No. Well,
the idea of changing the story.
Yeah, but they didn't do anything with Helen.
No.
It was mentioned by Simon, and this is an important book for me anyway. There's Krista Wolf's rewriting of Cassandra at Troy.
What's that called?
I'm sorry, Cassandra.
It's just called Cassandra.
And it's with a lot of her field notes, and it's worth reading, certainly more than once. In Cassandra, there's a third alternative again. Is approached by a slave woman, and she says, the slave woman says to Cassandra, leave, and go with us to the mountains to live. Forget to die and to kill. Or kill, die or kill. Cassandra said no. And you know what happens to her. Killed, mutilated, and so on. But it's, even, you know, Krista Wolf is trying to turn it around. Can't quite turn it around there. But because she does it, she really illustrates the strength of that story and how it wants to be said that way. I was talking to Kittler about this, and he said that he didn't understand either, but the force of the so-called notion of original story is so great on us that we cannot, we might be able to create other versions and variants and so on. Well, look what happens to, you know, with Oedipus here. It's, he's talked about here. Help me, what is it? 3, 4, 3. Where's it?
Why are there variants?
Where is it?
Beginning top of 34, the first paragraph after the 2 lines.
Okay, is Oedipus in there?
Oh, yeah.
No.
I wasn't sure what you was.
No, I don't want to go back to the
It's an index.
We should have written
42. Oedipus.
Oh, okay. What page is it?
What's 42?
42. Okay. It was. Okay. Thank you. Got indexing again. Here it is. It's on page 42, as I said. And it's right in the middle. And let's see, a good place to start. No, let's just start. Yes, that is so. And their oracles are always very dangerous. Wait a minute. Up at the top, this is it. Third line. In paganism, the gods do not speak. What do the gods do?
Give signs.
Give signs. That's what the gods do, and with the Sibyls do, the oracle does. The Sibyls are known for, they are represented in some sort of weird ways, like perched on rocks, and what they're doing is like throwing words at you, which are nonsense, okay? But given that you're in that culture, you know, oh my God, I need to figure out what this is all about. As a pedagogy, it's quite interesting, but no one wants to touch it. The gods do not speak to me, even when I consult them, JFL says. As they say, they signify, they do not speak. It cannot be said that the gods speak to me, certainly not in the Jewish sense. He's got to go for something that is prior to all the religions, okay, to something that is not, which is polytheism. One of the things, it's really interesting, one of the things that Deleuze does in his book on Nietzsche is to talk about the wills to power as different forces at work on human beings. And he says, and they are the polytheistic gods. That's what, in other words, what he's doing is picking that up and representing it with different words as well, making it a little more abstract. All that we have in Christianity is what, the angel, well, it depends. If you're a Protestant, maybe not. But if you're the one true religion, Catholicism, sure. I'm a pagan Catholic, okay, so I haven't gone to church, and, wherever I am, I'm in church, okay. And I was the kid who prayed for the devil also, because, it's very democratic. I remember the nuns saying, what? Okay. And then I was a wise-ass kid. I said, well, Judas, did he go to hell? I mean, isn't it, the case that Judas was good because he set forth the goodness of the opening of heaven and all that kind of stuff? She sat there with a blank face. She wasn't ready for that. Where was I? You let me get off and your fault.
The angel was speaking.
Angels.
On the shoulders?
Angels. Behind your back.
Oh, right. Yeah, you have the good angel and you have the devil, over here. It's just, it's a very medieval sort of stereoscopic view of the voices, that kind of thing. Anyway, I don't know where I think. And Apollo, okay, this is it. Yet there's no truthfulness, in fact, quite the contrary. In Apollo's oracle, defining Oedipus' fate, the utterance is focused on the narrated, which means that the Oedipus, who is seen on the stage, Sophocles' Oedipus, is already someone who belongs to a narrative, to the narrative that Apollo has made of him. He finds himself, therefore, in the pagan situation of having a kind of fate inflicted upon him by his utterance. But I think that we misunderstood completely when we turn this into a tragedy of consciousness or of the instincts. Because I think that for the Greeks, this oracle is to be taken, as you have said, with prudence. Prudence comes from Aristotle again. Act and prudence, the golden mean, and so on. With measure, golden mean. Perhaps even with humor. Humor. In some respects, Oedipus is a comic character, especially insofar as he remains stuck to Apollo's text, and that he does not know how to tell a story that would put forward a variant of the story in which he himself is narrated, that is, of which he is the hero. He does not know how to ruse as a narrator with the story of which he is the hero. This is his flaw. I am more and more convinced that this must have been a source of comedy to the Greeks. This is heretical as hell. I remember telling this to a dean of mine who was a Jesuit, and which, is something I have to tell you because it explains a lot of things. And he said, this is totally impossible. It's totally impossible. They all just, were suffering and crying. It's catharsis, and that's the way it was. There can be no variation there. And I thought, well, that's interesting. We just got to talk about variance and how do you extricate yourself in these situations. What is the tragedy? You're painted in a corner. You can't, and how do you get out? And the corner is usually two goods. And how do you choose between two goods? Antigone is about basically two goods. And how do you resolve them? Fusus nomos. How do you resolve it? You don't have, there's no criteria. So you have to create criteria with others, okay, and play the game to get yourself out of that corner. We missed you while you were gone. Because it wasn't that. And the relation with the gods, including the pragmatic relation. Okay. Excuse me. And the relation with the gods, including the pragmatic relation of discourses, does not obey a pragmatic border to border between the two perfectly defined blocks of two armies, or two verbal sets confronting each other. On the contrary, it is a place of ceaseless negotiations and ruses, which means that there is no reference by which to judge the opponent's strength. One does not know if she is a god or a human. You know, in that polytheistic world. Who in the hell am I talking to? It is a beggar, but it may be a god, since the other is metamorphic, and one will have to judge, therefore, by opinion alone, that is, without criteria. And here I get back to Aristotle. We are always within opinion, and there is no possible discourse of truth on the situation. And there is no such discourse because one is caught up in the story and one cannot get out of this story to take up a meta-linguistic position from which the whole could be dominated. We are always imminent to stories in the making, even when we are the ones telling the story to the other. Okay, jump down to the bigger big paragraph, but they are not gods in that sense at all. They are not all-knowing. They just have their stories that humans do not know. And humans have their own stories. And these two sets of stories are, if you will, not two blocks, but two centers that send out their elements to negotiate. If one can call it that on the boundaries. This is paganism. One does not know whom one is speaking to. One must be very prudent. One must negotiate. One must ruse. And one must be on the lookout when one has won.
And these narratives, these stories, at the beginning and end, without beginning or end, are figurative.
Say it again. They what?
They're figurative. Figural.
Yes, they are figurative.
As what he calls figural, because they're not just narratives of meanings of truth. They're
both discourse and figural.
They already include the figural.
And what traditional philosophers have attempted to do is to get the figural out of discourse. And they even shift from, everyday language to symbolic logic and so on, to try to gain some sort of stability. What you have in Badu is both. I mean, you have all the narratives and everything else, and then you have the set theory.
But if we go back to what you said, that the figural refigures discourse, in this variations, they're refigured by figures more than by narratives.
Yeah. And let's get back. That's bingo. Okay. Now let's get back to what I said. Why are we telling these same damn stories over and over again?
But with variations.
No. Well, no, there are variations there, but the primary story is the original story, and they're all the same. A woman is raped, and that event brings in the civilization. Lucretia kills herself because she was raped, and that brought in the Republic, the fall of law. Norman O'Brien writes about this a lot. Love's Body, an incredible title. And it's written in a Nietzschean style, very chunks and chunks and chunks, and fairly easy to follow. But he was not your typical classicist.
Can we talk about on page 34? in the middle of the page where it says, tradition is that which concerns time, not content, whereas the West wants from autonomy, invention, novelty, self-determination, is the opposite, to forget time and to preserve, acquire, and accumulate contents.
That's not at the beginning of the sentence? I mean, paragraph?
In the middle of the
In the middle of, tradition is that which concerns time. Okay.
Yeah.
Excuse me, not content, whereas what the West wants from autonomy, invention, novelty, self-determination is the opposite, to forget time and to preserve, acquire, and accumulate contents, and to turn them into what we call history. So, yeah.
I mean, has
And he says that's what tradition wants.
right, but how does that relate to telling the same story over and over again? I mean, yes, we have the content. We have the content of, this rape narrative. But what's the accumulation there?
The same. The return of the same, over and over again. Anything that's set up chronologically is going to lend itself. The use of chronology was Western chronology. When they got all these variants with these different calendars, they tried mathematically to line, philologists, tried to line them all up, okay, under BC, okay, before Christ, after. And then finally that got changed, before the Common Era and so on, but still it's chronological. And which does not allow for breaks and digressions. So in storytelling you can have that. I mean, look, you can, how do the epics start in many cases in medias res, right in the middle of the action. So you have a certain amount of suspense there. And as it progresses, it adds on, more here, and adds on here, adds on, and adds on. It works. But the goal is chronology at that point. Okay? But we have, what Bill Readings says in his book on an introduction to Lyotard is a whole section on chronology and anachronistic thinking, that with the crack of modernity, stories should not be told chronologically. They have to be told anachronistically. And so you're getting all of these films. Memento, Nolan, and what was the last one? You have to see it 100 times. What is it? I'm sorry, it's Precept or?
Inception.
Inception. He's playing around with time. And there's a forgetting in Memento. That's it. And he's got to put this documentary in the middle of it as a clue to how to view the film. Okay? Because if not, you would be totally lost. What's going on? So it's 7-minute or 10-minute and then he forgets. And then it starts over again. Okay, so remembrance of things lost. Okay, Bruce. A lot of people curse it. But it's an attempt to gather the sense of the flow of time. Look at Bergson and all that he wrote. Okay. So there are people out there writing about that. So how would you make a film today? What would you do besides writing arguments if you were writing a dissertation? Greg Allmer has contributed so much to a different logic. You have deduction, induction, okay, and you have abduction, which is generally called inference, okay, though there are variations on that. And then you have conduction, and conduction is an electronic logic, okay, and it parallels very well with Lyotard's The Different, who says Lyotard says, it is necessary to link, but not how to link. Get burned at the stake for that. It's necessary to link, but not how to link. So in The Different, what do you have to do, to get some sense of stories, to suggest that this is okay, or this is what brought about the loss of the necessity to link. He has to rewrite the history of philosophy in notes throughout the book. And he brings in people like Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein? What are you going to bring in Gertrude Stein? She's fucking crazy. And he refers to her as this is anarchy. And he brings in Gorgias. People, I mean, normally, philosophers don't want to talk about Gorgias. That my email ID is sophist, My colleagues just sort of chuckle at it. I mean, philosophers, they put up with it. They have to put up with themselves. So, how do you map out something? Okay. And can you imagine telling someone who teaches first year argumentation at a university that it's necessary to link but not how to link? Could you imagine putting but wherever you wanted to and paralogy wherever you want? You could just write it all paralogy and all the way through like kids do. We went to the movies and we had some popcorn and the movie broke and then I got up and I rolled down the aisles and so all the way through, You find a lot of that in Whitman's, paralogical constructions, but he gets the meaning through juxtapositions. They resonate and they create meaning. 1 minute he's talking about Abe Lincoln in one line and his cabinet. And the next he's talking about a streetwalker who is being made fun of by men in high hats. And this is a poet of democracy, where everything is equal. So it has to be and coordinating all the way. The logic is and all the way through. Okay? So time is. There is a logic and it's conductive logic. And it is filled, you can find it being used by Derrida, others. It's based in great part on homonyms, where you would bring homonyms together, which Aristotle in the Sophistic Refutations, which is part of the Argonaut, would say is a non sequitur. No, non sequitur, F. But what this approach of conductive logic allows for, two things: to write the paradigm, all the possible variants, and don't choose. Okay. And the second thing, it allows us to bring together things that in propositional thinking would never be brought to the surface. The excluded verb. We know what's being said. What isn't said here? What has been excluded? Who hasn't been considered? I mean, still in the world today, there are women who are second, third class, if any class whatsoever. They can't vote. If they commit a particular crime, they're going to be put to death. So whereas it's not that case for them. So, is that just? For us, it's not. For me, it's not. Let's do another page, or do you have other questions? And then we'll take a break.
Is paganism what Lyotard also calls postmodernism, or postmodern? I mean, is he just using those two concepts interchangeably, or?
What was the other one? Modernism?
Paganism and postmodern.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. They overlap, but they're really in different discussions. Yeah. Okay. People attack Lyotard because he talks about postmodernism, which is not periodic. Okay, and the bringing in of lots of little histories, okay, narratives, in a grand narrative itself. I think I mentioned that earlier, and they attack him for that. And it's an academic article. As I said earlier, if he had performed the whole thing, they would have got him, there too, saying it doesn't make any sense to me. Okay? Because it does not follow the protocol that I use. A lot of academics say it has to be the academic protocol for the advancement of knowledge. And a lot of times people will write something that is experimental, and then, the academics will pull out their, they got the template in their heads, and they start reading, and it doesn't work for them, therefore it's garbage. But, they're pretty much the same. And what is postmodernism, that article? That is attached to the Minnesota, I think it's Minnesota, isn't it? That published the postmodern condition. They weren't published together to begin with. And in that, he begins to talk about what postmodern means, okay? That one is making up the rules and the criteria that's going on. Okay? And one way to tell a story that way. Well, what about the truth? People are going to say. We need to know what happened in the past. Why? So that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past. Do we have agreement on what the mistakes are? Just to begin with, we don't. And maybe a mistake was good. There are people who have read it that way. Pearl Harbor is the best thing that ever happened to us. Some people will say. There is this, I can't remember who wrote this. It was a man who was in Auschwitz. He says, it's the greatest thing that ever happened to me. It made me a man. And so you'll have people who will say those things. And so what are you going to do? Silence them? Or, you try to understand what this means. How could that happen? Well, it's possible that all those things can happen. The most horrible thing could be, in the long run, a good thing. You don't know. Or it can be interpreted that way and be very compelling. The story of Judas. Okay. We needed a Judas, to advance the story, right? And so he did a good. Because the story would have frozen there. Okay. It'd still be in Gethsemane. Or whatever. Shall we take a break? Yeah, yes.
Well, just in relation to that, Carlos Fuentes, the Spanish writer, has a beautiful reading of that part of Lyotard, taking off from postmodernism, but I think going into this, he shows how what we have always done, at least in Latin America, he reads many Latin American authors, and not only of the boom of the 60s, but from the colonial times, we've always done multi-narratives. Mm-hmm. And he switches all that around with, instead of uni-narratives or whatever, universal, to multi-narratives. And I was thinking, while you were explaining rehearing you the pagan part, it's so embedded in the Latin American culture, not just in this, not because of this, this Indian example is perfect, but it is part of our lives to be not following any rules, reinventing them, and contradicting all the processes. Very close to this Indians in Colombia, there's a tradition that who knows when, of troubadours that are still alive in the coast, and instead of being in the margin in the same way as here between Peru and, they're always moving, and they tell the same stories over and over and over and over again. It's been very well studied. They're called vallenatos, and vallenatos, the kind of music, because they come from the valleys. Vallenatos, from the valleys, people move from one place to the other, and they still exist. Unfortunately, commercial entities have, made records, and you've probably heard about. I forgot the name of the singer, not Shakira, but the guy. He's supposed to sing vallenatos all around the world. They're not, because the whole idea of a vallenato is the story's told, and they start the same way. One day, the story told by our ancestors, and every time it's a different story. So,
we do it in everything. Think of music. One of the compositional possibilities is to reverse the melody. Didn't get in trouble, but to reverse the melody, change the rhythm, but it's still there. Very preferred.